This is the CUNYCast, smart voices, good stories, and thought-provoking conversation from the City University of New York. I'm Rick Firstman.
This was the first time in my entire life that I had ever seen Puerto Ricans figure as main characters in a major motion picture. And that impact that I felt, I dare to say, was felt by everyone of my generation. In spite of any criticism that we could have of that movie.
That's Virginia Sánchez Korrol remembering the first time she saw West Side Story as a recent Brooklyn College graduate in 1961. 60 years later, she's a professor emerita at Brooklyn and a founding figure in the field of Latino and Puerto Rican studies. And as a first-generation Puerto Rican New Yorker who came of age in the 1950s, she's not only a scholar of the Puerto Rican experience at the heart of West Side Story, she lived it herself. That made her a natural choice to serve as the historical consultant for Steven Spielberg's new version of the film, which opens this week. It was an important behind-the-scenes role for a movie whose original, though beloved for its music and dance by Bernstein, Sondheim, and Robbins, has been fraught with criticism of stereotypes and the casting of white actors with darkened faces in the roles of Puerto Ricans. In Spielberg's new version, all the Puerto Rican characters are played by Latinx actors and dancers. What Korrol provided Spielberg and screenwriter Tony Kushner was an historical and cultural backstop that helped them tell a more authentic story. Virginia Sánchez Korrol joins me on this episode of the CUNYCast to talk about her involvement in the project, her views on cultural integrity, and how she's brought the movie home to Brooklyn College with a webcast lecture series this fall called West Side Story, The Brooklyn Connection. You can find more about that, including links to videos, on our episode page. I asked Professor Korrol how she came to be the film's historical consultant, and she said it all started the day 2.5 years ago when she was invited to what turned out to be the first gathering of the cast before production began. The strange thing, she said, was that she really didn't know why she was there. And then came her first encounter with Steven Spielberg.
I knew that Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner were going to produce a new version of West Side Story, and they had been meeting with different focus groups around the nation and in Puerto Rico, and I figured, okay, it's one of those, and that's what's going to happen. It's good. I'm glad. They should be doing this. They started to introduce me to people like some of the young stars and in the film, and 2 other speakers who were there. I turned around and there was Steven Spielberg walking towards me. And I said to myself, oh, okay, he's here. And so at that point, Steven came over and introduced himself to me. And I didn't say hi. I didn't say, I'm delighted to meet you. I didn't say, let's take a picture. In fact, he said, I want to take a picture with Virginia, and we did that. All I said was, why are you doing this? I couldn't take those words back. He began to tell me why he was doing this. And he told me, and I mean, he's written about this and he's talked about it, how he had always wanted to make a musical, and he felt that this was the perfect time. And I thought of the 1961 movie, and I realized that scholars began to write critically about West Side Story. And they were criticizing the movie for the stereotypical way that the Puerto Rican community was represented, and for the darkening of the skin of basically white actors who were playing the roles of Puerto Ricans. The only person of Puerto Rican who was Puerto Rican, of Puerto Rican descent, in that 1961 movie was Rita Moreno. And the criticism was that basically that film was very problematic. And so I thought well, this is what I would have told him. I thought, your reputation is going to be shot. A man of such, who produces such quality films, who has a sense of justice, who has a sense of social justice and equity and all the things that he does right. Why would he want to take on West Side Story at this point in time? That's what I wanted to say.
But so you were thinking that he was going to do the same thing in terms of stereotypes?
Well, I didn't know what he was going to do. I just thought that it was a hot potato, and anybody taking on this film at this point in time, especially at this point in time, had to prepare for a lot of negativity from an audience that was beginning to become aware of the fact that the minority groups are left out of American films. They're not producers, they're not the actors, they're not the writers, they are left out. This lack of sensitivity to minority communities, the stereotypical idea of what these communities were like. And I thought, why would Steven Spielberg want to do this? So the point that I was at was, wow, they've got to show me. I got to see what they're doing. They've got to show me what they're doing.
And I guess one thing they did show you that day was that all the Puerto Rican parts would be played by Latinx actors and dancers. So that was one big difference. So tell me what your role became as the film's historical consultant.
Well, first I lectured that day to the cast and crew. It was the first meeting of the entire cast and crew. Tony Kushner introduced himself to me, and Rita Moreno was there as well. Tony said, "Would you read my script?" And I almost died on the spot. He wants me to read his script? Tony Kushner wants me to read his script? I had written or co-edited some 16 books by this point, and I felt totally inadequate to read a script. But I said, of course. He said, I just want to make sure that there aren't any gringoisms, he called it. I want to make sure that I'm on the right track. And then we met to discuss the script and the role, and at the end of that session, he said, we'd like you to be with the film. The role of a historical consultant is to look for accuracy in a script, and to look for anything that is bizarre in terms of that particular time and place and community. And so that's what I did. That doesn't mean that he would then rewrite his script or that I would have any role in writing the script. I did not. But we would discuss certain items that would come up, argue over language or over what kind of cultural events were going on in that community at that time.
You've seen the film.
Yes.
So did you recognize anything that
yes,
he changed because of
No, not
your...
that he changed.
Yeah.
That he already had in the script, but he made some adjustments. The type of coffee that people are buying in a Puerto Rican community in 1957. He had coffee, but I knew the type of coffee.
He had the wrong coffee.
He had the wrong coffee. We think we better change it to this coffee.
What was the right coffee, for the record?
Oh, not Bustelo, but probably a Pico or something like that. But we had a better exchange over words, which he mentioned in his video. The word lajara. The word lajara was a common word that we kids used in the neighborhood. It meant the cops are coming. It meant, be careful, there's a cop car, be careful, the cops are coming. Usually when we were doing something we weren't supposed to, like opening a fire hydrant during the summer. or hiding the wrench that you open the fire hydrant with. And so it was in the script, and I said, I'm glad that you've got this word in the script. Because this is significant. This is a marker for that particular time and place. And he said, oh no, we took it out. I said, why did you take it out? Why did you take that word out? And the response was, well, because we asked the kids in the cast, and they weren't too sure, and they called their parents. And at that point, I said, that's because they were supposed to have called their grandparents, not their parents. La Jara was the slang word that we use for cops, and it comes from O'Hara, because at that particular time, the police force was heavily Irish. And it made absolute sense. Anybody who has lived in that time period would know that.
Right, that's so funny.
So things like that we
Right.
discussed at length. We discussed the characters. For example, because the cast was young, and so few of them have had an opportunity to read anything about that time period. They wondered what the role of women was. For example, we have a story that is often described as two gangs fighting with one another. And and again, Tony says this. One of the first things that I told him was, don't underestimate the women. The women are working. The women are keeping home. The women have kids in school. Do not underestimate the power of the women in these communities. And apparently Stephen took that to heart. And so the young women in the cast would ask, well, what did we do? And at one point I said, not much of anything, because you're a sex object. And they said, what? I said, look, it doesn't matter what you're doing, but basically women in the 1950s are not expected to do anything more than marry and have children. And this is your aim, and this is what you're looking for. They were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe it.
Tony Kushner said that in the first day of rehearsal, when you first came on to talk with them, that West Side Story as a feminist musical is something that's under considered, he said. Mm-hmm. And that the story is not so much Jets versus Sharks, but the white boys versus the Puerto Rican women. In
the 1957 play, in the 1961 movie, and in the present movie, there's only one family that is intact. You see the inside of their home. You see the building that they live in. You see where Maria works. You don't see that for any of the Jet women, or for any of the Jet men. You do not place them in a family situation. Their language, their English, accented as it is proper English. It follows the proper word construction, so that they've gone to school in whether it's in Puerto Rico or in New York, because you're also dealing with two different Puerto Rican groups in New York at this time. One that traces their beginnings in New York to the 1920s or earlier. Actually, they date back to the 19th century. And another that are recent arrivals right after the Second World. And the group that comes right after the Second World War is the group that is invading that community with their stores and their cheap apartments and near train lines. They can go to work. It is an emerging community. And so to me, that signified a great deal of togetherness, of composure, of knowing where you're going, of a rising community rather than a community that is falling.
So
Yeah.
you're not only a historian of the Puerto Rican experience in New York, but you were a part of that post-war community that's
Right.
depicted in West Side Story, and you came of age in those years. Can you give me a little idea of how your experience compared? I know this is not a documentary, West Side Story, but did it track the experience of those years for you? Did you see that represented in the original film, and is it different in the new one?
You did see it represented in the original film, but I think that that's something that becomes stronger in the new film. I think that you're going to, and with good reason. When the '61 movie was made, we didn't have the scholarship. We didn't have the textbooks. We didn't have the histories. The literature that was being written by Puerto Ricans in that post-war migration was usually in Spanish. There were perhaps one or two writers that are important who wrote in English because they understood that the future generations were going to be speaking English. But basically you didn't have, Bernstein and company did not have the resources at that point. The 1950s is a time when there is a great deal of discrimination coming from American society as a whole. And the discrimination is coming from institutions, from law enforcement, from education, from jobs. As it has happened with other groups when they first established themselves in New York, they are the scapegoats. The press was horrible in terms of its description of the Puerto Rican community, and the social scientists who were beginning to write about them wrote about them in terms of an assimilation. This group has got to assimilate. It doesn't have a structure, a community structure. They failed to see that it did have a community structure. And the establishment of Puerto Rican studies and Latinx and Cuban and Chicano and Mexican and women's studies and gay studies and African American, all of that brings richness to to scholarship.
What do you remember about the movie at the time when you first saw it in 1961? Very different perspective, I would imagine.
Very, very different perspective. I graduated from Brooklyn College in 1916. We were married and left for Chicago. There were two things that I was looking at in the movie, actually three. The first was that I was an English lit teacher, and the day that we went to see the movie, I had just taught Romeo and Juliet. And so uppermost in my mind were Romeo and Juliet and the scenes and the characters. The second thing that I saw in that movie was that the story of the star-crossed lovers, the story of the families fighting one another, had just happened to us because we had married in spite of the family. The family didn't want us to marry.
Your husband, your now husband,
yes.
Then your husband then also, but
yes.
Just had gotten married.
Right.
Jewish boy from
yes.
Brooklyn.
Absolutely.
How did that go?
Right. So that it's horrible. So a good thing we left for Chicago. Otherwise, we would have never. we wouldn't have endured. So there's something about being on your own and having to to figure things out on your own.
Right.
So that was also very impactful, and I actually told that story to the cast and crew. The third thing about it that was interesting to me, not just beyond interesting, more than interesting, was the fact that this was the first time in my entire life that I had ever seen Puerto Ricans figure as main characters in a major motion picture. Up until this time, the movies that were available to us, if they had a Puerto Rican character, it was always a teenager who was violent and was, killing people, a teenager who couldn't make it in school. We were the scapegoats, and this story was different, and that impact that I felt, I dare to say, was felt by everyone of my generation. In spite of any criticism that we could have of that movie, we were more excited. As one of my colleagues says, it didn't matter that we were supposed to be a violent gang, at least we were being seen instead of being invisible. And that movie for us was enormously important. And of course, Rita Moreno being in it was enormously important. But by the time 10, 15 years later, when you begin to read the critical analysis of the young scholars, and you're saying, wow, I didn't see it like that.
So there was no thought at the time of, why are these Puerto Rican characters being played by white actors, two of the three Puerto Rican leads?
There was no problem with that. I didn't see a problem with that. I looked for good acting. I had a minor in theater when I started at Brooklyn College, which was another big surprise to Tony. When we met to go over the script, and then I was able to tell him, well, I had a minor in theater. This doesn't work. And he would say, I said, I had a minor in theater. I've taught English literature, and I'm doing Puerto Rican studies. So that I had all these bases covered, and he was amazed. And I used to produce plays when I was a high school teacher. So we always did the senior play, and so I was aware of staging, and I was aware of acting, so that it didn't impact me negatively at all. I thought it was a fine film, and it is. It is.
So the whole debate about casting and cultural appropriation, and who gets to make art about what. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about that in context of the original and the new movie?
I guess I didn't think too much about that. For the original movie, like who gets to make, the people who get to make were the people in power, and we weren't in power. So I would never sit and watch the 1961 movie and say, oh, that should have been done by a Latinx writer or a Latinx producer, or that would have never occurred to me. This time around, when I met Stephen and Tony and the rest of the creative team, well, of course I was very excited about the whole thing. I mean, how could you not be? But in terms of thinking, wow, these people should not be making this movie because we have plenty of writers and producers who should be doing this now, I kind of waited to see what they were doing. I didn't walk out and say, I'm not going to work with these people. I wanted these people happen to be geniuses in their field. The products that they have brought to the screen have been the work of very sensitive people who are at the top of their game and don't just look at a movie in terms of what it's going to make at the box office.
So, how do Spielberg and Kushner handle the cultural conflict at the core of the story for today's times? And I know this is one of the things that you explored in the conversation with Tony Kushner that you had as part of Brooklyn College's online lecture series on West Side Story. Does the new movie render the outsider community that you were actually part of differently than the original?
I think with a lot more understanding, with a lot more. One of my questions to Tony in our video was, what do you do? How do you inhabit another culture? And he went on to explain that. He says, well, I'm a nerd, so the first thing I do is I read everything, and then I immerse myself with people. I know I'm not part of it, but if I can get most of this right, it's going to be worth it. And that's what they both do. From my perspective and the short amount of time that I was with them, but we also continue to work, and I continue to work. My third job on this film was to join there is a community advisory board that was put together to help the film get over some of these rough spots. And they're made up of people from Latino organizations, movie makers, writers, and I was asked would I work with them from the first day I was there. And I immediately said yes. And then when I became hired by the film, I questioned whether there was is there a conflict of interest, because I'm working with the film, but also advising. And they had a big meeting over that, and they decided that, it was perfectly all right. And as a result of my work with the advisory board, I came up with the idea of doing the lecture series for Brooklyn College. Because to me, if the work that you're doing doesn't reach students, it doesn't serve a purpose to educate. That's what I can give. That's what I do. So if it doesn't serve a purpose to educate, then it's really not worthwhile doing.
So after spending many months consulting, meeting, having conversations, so then they begin shooting at Steiner Studio in Brooklyn, and you get to go on set and see this come alive. What was that like?
It's very interesting how that all comes about, because you don't actually see them shooting. You're going to see it on a tablet, what they're shooting. So, which surprised me, because when you do a play, you go to see the rehearsals and you see what's happening. But here you've got a tablet. And what also surprised me was the repetition, the constant repetition. You got to do it again. You got to do it again. And so there's a lot of time on the set, because everybody's there, to talk about things like educational projects. Well, what kind of educational project can we get out of this film? What can we do with it? One day I suggested that I think the chancellor of the city university should come to the set. What do you think? And Tony said, well, okay. I said, look, this is the largest university in the entire United States. The chancellor is Puerto Rican, actually born in Puerto Rico. And originally a Puerto Rican studies, the head of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. I think he should come to the set. And Tony thought about it, and he said, let's go tell Stephen we want him to come to the set. Stephen said, okay. And okay, now I go to Christy. Christy, we want the chancellor to come to the set. What day? He wants to meet Rita Moreno. What day? Because we want to interest Rita in the archives at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. It would be fantastic if we had her papers or whatever memorabilia she's planning to leave for educational purposes. And so we finally got a date when everybody was going to be there, and the fellow came, and he came early, and he was there maybe 4 hours, got to know everybody on the set, and we were thinking now we have an opportunity, because now they know us and we know them. So we have an opportunity for maybe Rita coming to look at the archives and leaving her papers, maybe Stephen doing something for Centro, like a screening or something that would be above and beyond. And then, of course, there's our lecture series that we had been planning. So that's an example of when I say that there was a lot of give and take with the community of non-actors that they had attached to them. That was a very, very good example because they understood University of New York is important. And it is, and many of the campuses are already Spanish-serving campuses. The majority students are minority students, and that was an eye-opener to them. They would have never had any relationship with the educational system if we hadn't done that.
That's great. And meanwhile, you were a hit with a lot of the young cast members who were all Latinx actors this time around. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it was one of the first day that I came to actually see a shoot. It was the dance at the gym, so there were hundreds of people on the gym floor, and the musicians are playing, and there's repeating the scenes, repeating the dance steps, doing it over and over and over again. And when we got into the room where Tony was working, it was a tiny, tiny room. And he said, sit anywhere. But he wanted me to sit so that I could see what was happening, because he was trying to teach me what was going on. And I looked at the chairs, and they were all directors' chairs, and all of a sudden there is my name on a director's chair. So I acted really cool. I pretended I didn't see it. But that was the chair I wanted to sit on, and it was in the back. And I'm saying, how can I get that chair over here? Because it's my chair. When we left that room and came into the large gymnasium, Stephen came over to me and he said, how do you like your chair? And I said, I love it. I love it. He said, good, I thought you'd like it. That day when we were leaving, it was the dance at the gym was the first successful shoot. And there are all these clips online now of Stephen toasting the actors because of there's a tradition, he says, that the first successful shoot and the last shoot are always toasted with champagne. And so we had to leave, but in order for me to leave the room, I had to cut across the gym floor. And all these hundreds of actors who had just been dancing their hearts out, and they're there exhausted and sweating and just exhilarated by their movements and the dance. They're all on the floor, and I have to get through. And Stephen is telling them what a good job they've done. And Tony Kushner realizes that there are a lot of electrical connections on the floor, and that I could fall. So he takes my hand, he's going to lead me out, and he's going to wait with us until our car comes, and so I tapped Stephen on the shoulder just to let him know that we were leaving, and he turns around, and it was like, oh, Virginia. And he takes my hand and he kisses my hand goodbye, and the entire auditorium burst out into applause. And I'm going, oh my God, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. It was great. That was one of the most fun parts,
Well, that
we
is quite a dramatic exit. And what a great experience.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And the amazing thing is that it should happen at this point in my life. So I'm no longer starstruck.
You're the star. Well, the film opens December 10th.
Yes.
And we're all looking forward to it. Thanks so much for talking with me about it today.
Thank you. This has been lovely and a pleasure.